Hi, in this short video I'm going to talk a little bit about characterization, how an author frames and shows his or her characters in a story. So characters are the most important aspects of fiction. They're the people of the story, and without characters, we wouldn't have a story. At the very least, an author needs to have characters in order to have a conflict. Sometimes, though, an entire story is just about characterization, helping us to understand an odd and quirky or intriguing character. Forrest Gump is kind of like this. Conflict is the tension in the story, and the tension in the story is usually related to the protagonist. The protagonist is the central character of a work. It's usually the character that we sympathize with the most, however, not always. Superman, for instance, is the antagonist of the Superman movies, and he's undeniably a good guy, and the villains that he imposes are undeniably bad guys. However, sometimes protagonists of stories are also bad guys, like Don Corleone in The Godfather is a notorious bad guy. We probably don't like him very much, but he's still the central character that we follow. The antagonist isn't always a person, but oftentimes the antagonist is a person who directly opposes the protagonist. For instance, in superhero movies, very often there's an anti-hero or a villain that opposes the superhero. So protagonist, hero, antagonist, villain. In the Harry Potter movies, for instance, Harry Potter's the protagonist, and Voldemort very often is the antagonist. There are many different types of characters that you can encounter in a story, too. A dynamic character is a character that undergoes some kind of change because of the action of the story, or the character is somehow different as a result of what happens in the story. And this is the case with most movies that we watch, or most stories that we read. For instance, in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge undergoes a change as a result of his experience. He's a dynamic character. He's completely different by the end of the story. In Story of an Hour, Mrs. Mallard also undergoes a change when she hears the news of her husband's death. She realizes that she's going to be free, and she's actually happy that her husband died. A static character is one that never changes as a result of the action of the story. So, for instance, Jake in Love in L.A. is a static character because he doesn't change, even though he has this experience in a story that in another character might cause him to behave differently. Jake doesn't. He runs into Mariana, but he's going to keep on, sort of being a bad guy. A flat character is one that's just not very well developed in a story. A lot of times these characters are kind of like window dressing. For instance, the husband and the child in Sorrowful Woman are both flat characters because we don't really learn anything about those characters. They're just sort of, like window dressing, background in the story. A round character is a character that's much more complex and much more developed. These characters often surprise us and intrigue us because we can't pin them down. We don't know exactly what's going on with these characters or exactly how these characters are going to behave in different situations. The woman in Sorrowful Woman is a round character. Also, Sammy from the A&P is a good example of a round character. He's very well developed, and we learn a lot about him, and he surprises us in many different ways. Characterization is how the author develops the character's personality and identity so we can understand what that character is like. An author can characterize in two ways. First, the author can tell us about a character or describe characteristics of that person. Second, an author can show us what a character is like through the character's action or words. In Story of an Hour, Kate Chopin tells us that Mrs. Mallard had a heart attack and tells us that Mrs. Mallard feels free after learning of her husband's death. We learn that she's happy that she's going to have lots of years ahead of her. So those are things that Chopin is directly telling us in the story. However, in Love in L.A., Glib doesn't tell us about Jake, not being a nice guy. He shows us that Jake's not a nice guy through the actions that Jake has done. Right? He never comes out directly and says, "Oh, this guy Jake's a slimeball." He doesn't tell us anything like that. We have to deduce the fact that Jake is a slimeball because he's, constantly trying to manipulate people and get things for free. And in the end, we find out that he's stolen license plates off a car. Those actions speak louder than words, to use a cliche, and show us what Jake is really like. So that's what you want to always be on the lookout for, because although an author will sometimes tell us a little bit about a character, most characterization is built through showing us actions, showing us language that characters use, and we have to sort of deduce, what's this character like. Sometimes an author will actually tell us the opposite, right? Of what it will tell us that a character is a certain way, but then we see through the character's actions that he or she is totally different. This happens a lot in Jane Austen's books. Jane Austen will tell us a lot about a character, but then have that character behave a totally different way. So be on the lookout for that too. Authors aren't always straightforward and truthful with us about who and what their characters are like. A foil character is a character that's put in a story to highlight some aspect of the protagonist by either having similar characteristics or having opposite characteristics. Right? So you want to be on the lookout for characters that are very similar to the protagonist or characters that are the complete opposite of the protagonist, because the way those characters behave often tell us a little bit about the protagonist. In A&P, for instance, Stokesy and L'Engle are both foils for Sammy, right? They all work at the stores. They all sort of have that in common, and they're all men. They're also a little bit different in age, though, right? So Sammy is the youngest. He's 19. But when he looks at Stokesy, he notes about Stokesy that Stokesy's married with 2 babies chalked up on his fuselage already, but as far as I can tell, that's the only difference between him and Sammy. The only difference is Stokesy's 22, right? And he has a couple of kids, and Sammy mentions in the next line, I forgot to say, Stokesy thinks he's going to be manager of the A&P someday. So Sammy, very similar to Stokesy, except Stokesy's a little bit older and hopes to someday own or run the A&P. A little bit older is L'Engle. He's the manager of the A&P. He's also a man, but he's much older. And L'Engle is not a very nice guy, right? It says L'Engle's pretty dreary. He teaches Sunday school and the rest, but he doesn't miss much. And actually, when we first hear of L'Engle, he's arguing with a cabbage salesman. And he's very rude to the girls, and we can tell that he's just kind of like a hardened, cranky sort of guy. So in a way, even though John Updike never tells us this, when we look at Stokesy, we can sort of see, here's a guy who's a little bit older, who's never going to escape the A&P, because he has kids and he's relying on the job, right? And if he doesn't escape the A&P, someday he'll be like L'Engle running the A&P. So there's just this sort of a way that the A&P sort of degrades you, or turns you into a cranky old man. And I think part of the reason Sammy walks out is because he sort of realizes that this is kind of the path that he's on, and he's not sure that he wants to be on that path. He doesn't want to be L'Engle eventually someday. And he doesn't even want to be Stokesy, working here in 3 or 4 years. The A&P is not really for him. So you want to make sure that you pay attention carefully to how an author develops the main characters and the minor characters in a story. Oftentimes their actions and the words that they speak tell us so much more about the characters than the author tells us about the characters. So that's just a little bit on characterization, but happy reading.